T's funny how chopping vegetables can feel like therapy. I never really thought about cooking much before Elena and I got together, but over the years, it became one of those things I looked forward to. It gave me a kind of peace, a rhythm to follow when everything else felt off-kilter. Tonight was no different. The rosemary and thyme filled up our fancy Kensington kitchen, and for a few minutes, I let myself imagine this was just another quiet evening, like it used to be. Just her and me, no tension. I just started the sauce when I heard the click of her heels on the tile. Elena was in the doorway, and I didn't need to look up to know something was different. When I finally glanced up, I couldn't miss it. The red dress, the hair, the perfume that wasn't hers. A real punch in the gut. She'd dressed up for something, but it sure wasn't me. "Don't bother waiting up, Adrian." Her voice was calm, like she was commenting on the weather. She gave a quick look in the toaster's reflection, adjusting her lipstick like I wasn't even there. I stopped chopping, knife in hand. "Plans?" I asked, keeping my tone steady. Felt like a pointless question, but I needed to hear what she'd say. Her eyebrow went up, her mouth curling into a smirk that I hadn't seen in years. "Yes, Adrian." "Plans," she replied. Her eyes flicked over me, cold as ice. I could feel my grip tighten on the knife, but I just nodded. There wasn't much left to say. Without another word, she turned on her heel and left, her footsteps echoing down the hall. I just stood there, watching her go, staring at the door as it swung shut. The kitchen was silent, except for the gentle simmer of the sauce I'd been stirring. And in that silence, something finally clicked. Maybe I'd known it deep down for a while, but seeing her like that made it real. This wasn't some phase or rough patch. She was done with us. She'd been done for a while. Only now, I realized, maybe it was time I did something about it too. After she left, I stayed there in the kitchen for a while, just staring at the door. The food on the counter, half prepped, felt pointless now. I didn't even have the energy to finish it. I cleaned up, wiped down the counters, and put the vegetables back in the fridge. Some habits are hard to break, I guess. I tried to ignore that uneasy feeling twisting in my gut as I sat at the dining table. The empty chair across from me looked like a bad joke. 15 years. 15 damn years. And here I was, eating alone in silence. I picked up my phone and stared at the number I hadn't called in months. Carl. Carl's been with me almost as long as Elena has. My right-hand guy, someone I'd trusted through every deal and every crisis at the company. Hell, he'd seen me through more than a few personal ones, too. He knew me. Knew what this call would mean, what it would set into motion. I dialed the number, and within 2 rings, he picked up. "Carl, it's Adrian." He didn't need more than that. "Understood," he said, his voice calm, like we were just setting up a meeting. "Protocol 6. Tonight," I replied, glancing around the empty room. I could practically feel Elena's perfume lingering in the air, taunting me. "Got it, boss. I'll get the team started. Anything else you need?" For a second, I thought about stopping him, about giving her one last chance. But I knew better. I'd given her too many already. "No, that's all. Keep me updated." As soon as I hung up, I felt a strange sort of calm settle over me. Protocol 6 wasn't just some business tactic. It was something I'd set up months ago, back when I first got the feeling she was pulling something behind my back. Turns out, my gut had been right. I'd suspected there was someone else, a smooth-talking grifter named Victor Davila. I knew him, everyone in our circle did. A socialite with nothing but debt and empty promises. I had proof too. Bank statements, phone records, photos. She thought she was sneaky, but Elena had always underestimated me. Tonight, she'd made her choice. After the call, I felt like a switch had flipped in me. That whole night, I barely moved from the table. Just sat there, replaying things in my head, the red dress, the perfume, the way she hadn't even looked at me. Felt like every moment of the last 15 years was piling up, reminding me how I'd kept ignoring the signs. By midnight, I couldn't stand the silence anymore, so I did something I hadn't done in years. I poured myself a glass of scotch, sat by the window, and stared out over the city. The London skyline was quiet, almost peaceful, and I wondered how long it would take for her to realize everything she thought she was getting away with was slipping through her fingers. I checked my phone, and there it was, a text from Carl. "Done." One word, but I knew what it meant. Carl had been handling the details, gathering everything we'd need to shield my assets from her and Victor. By the time they'd wake up tomorrow, anything linked to Hayes Global would be out of reach. Accounts frozen, properties tied up in legal red tape they'd never get through. I'd made sure she couldn't take 1 cent more than she'd already drained. I thought about Victor, laughing it up with her somewhere, celebrating their little scheme. They had no idea that by morning, they'd be locked out of everything. No more shopping sprees on my cards. No more vacations on my dime. It was over. But the weirdest part? I didn't feel angry. I thought I would, thought there'd be more of that gut-wrenching rage. But all I felt was relief. The hours ticked by, but sleep wasn't happening. I ended up pacing, moving through each room in the penthouse like I was seeing it for the first time. The place felt different, colder somehow, like I'd finally seen the reality behind the life Elena and I had built. This was supposed to be our sanctuary, our home, but now all I could feel was emptiness. In the study, I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a file I'd hoped never to touch. It was thick, filled with all the details Carl and I had gathered over the past months. Proof that every suspicion I'd tried to ignore was dead on. I sat down and spread out the evidence, piece by piece, until my desk was a mess of receipts, statements, and photographs. There it all was, every lie she'd woven together, and every expense I'd unknowingly funded. I picked up a bill for a high-end hotel suite, supposedly for a business trip she'd taken last month. My eyes moved down the itemized list: room service for 2, champagne, spa charges. It was almost laughable how little she'd tried to cover her tracks. She'd been so sure I was too busy with my own life to notice what was happening in hers. Then there were the photos, proof that was hard to stomach, even when I'd known the truth for months now. In one, she was with Victor, sitting close at a private table, her hand resting casually on his arm like they were in their own little world. They looked relaxed, happy. Nothing like the cold woman I'd watched walk out of our kitchen tonight. I couldn't help but wonder if any part of her missed the life we'd built, or if it had just been about the thrill, the money, the escape from whatever she decided she didn't want from me anymore. When the anger started to build again, I forced myself to look away. Getting mad wasn't going to change anything, and honestly, I was past it. I just felt done. I tossed the photo back on the desk and took a deep breath. At least by morning, this whole nightmare would start closing in on her. Then my phone buzzed. Another message from Carl. Securities in place. Locks changed tomorrow. The last line hit me with a strange finality. By the time she tried to come back here, everything would be different. She wouldn't be able to waltz in and out as she pleased, grabbing things and carrying on with her double life. This place would be mine again, cleared of the whole mess she'd made of it. I leaned back, staring out the window at the London skyline, the lights glowing soft against the darkness. I imagined her out there somewhere, laughing with Victor, completely unaware that the ground was about to give way under her. She'd wake up to find herself shut out of everything she'd taken for granted. The credit cards she used like Monopoly money? Frozen. The joint accounts? Inaccessible. The penthouse she'd strutted out of without a second glance? Locked. I'd prepared every last step, and I'd let her think she was winning right up until the last second. For the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. I finally drifted off to sleep sometime after 3, but it was light and restless. I was awake again before dawn, lying there in bed, staring up at the ceiling as the first bit of morning light crept through the curtains. For a moment, I felt an odd sense of clarity. Everything I'd been holding on to, every bit of loyalty, every ounce of love or hope, felt like it had finally drained out of me. What was left was a kind of calm, like knowing the worst was already behind me. By 6, I was up, dressed, and had packed away some of her things. It was surreal, boxing up 15 years of her presence in my life. Her clothes, the trinkets she'd picked up on vacations, the books she'd never actually read but liked the look of on our shelves. As I packed, I couldn't help but think of all the times I'd overlooked the cracks, the way she'd slip out for hours, the distant look she'd started giving me around the dinner table. But I'd ignored it, because, at the end of the day, I'd still wanted to believe she was my partner. I called Carl again around 7. He picked up immediately, sounding as alert as if he'd been awake for hours. "All right, Carl. Let's finalize everything." "Already in motion," he said calmly. sounding as though he'd expected this. The locks are being changed as we speak, and the accounts are secure. If she tries to access them, it'll trigger an alert, and her access will be cut instantly. No loopholes. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. And Victor? He's about to get a surprise himself, Carl replied. His accounts are being flagged, his debts called in, and his condo, leased under your name by the way, has been reclaimed. By noon, he won't be able to rent a room in a cheap hostel without a payment issue. I let out a small laugh, the kind that doesn't come from humor but from sheer satisfaction. Perfect. As I hung up, I checked my watch. I pictured her and Victor out somewhere, probably celebrating their so-called freedom, completely unaware that they'd wake up to find everything they'd planned slipping through their fingers. And if they thought they could talk their way out of it, they had no idea how many layers I'd built into this. Protocol 6 wasn't just about cutting her off financially, it was about leaving them with nothing to grab onto when they fell. The door buzzed, and I looked through the security monitor to see a courier standing there with a box of documents and a USB drive, everything Carl and I had put together as proof of her betrayal. The divorce papers were there too, thick with evidence of her cheating, her financial disloyalty, everything documented in painstaking detail. I signed for it and set the box down on the table, thinking about where to send it. Part of me knew her mother's place was the only option. She'd go there to lick her wounds, and the family deserved to know the truth about what she'd done, even if she never admitted it. Her mother had always liked to pretend things were perfect, that Elena was perfect. Maybe seeing all this would finally crack through that image. So I attached a note, brief and final. For Elena. With love, Adrian. By mid-morning, the penthouse was quiet, almost eerily so. The boxes were stacked neatly by the door, her clothes and possessions sorted out and ready to be shipped to her mother's. The silence felt like a blank slate, a strange, heavy freedom that settled in as I went through the motions of clearing out what was left of her in my life. I'd expected it to feel bitter, even painful, but instead, I felt a weight lifting. Just after 11, I checked my phone and saw a new message from Carl. Elena just tried to access the Kensington account. Blocked. I pictured her shock, maybe even panic, as she realized she was locked out. She probably hadn't even thought to check the accounts until she needed something. Maybe booking a hotel room or picking up some last-minute gift for Victor. She'd been reckless, always assuming the money would be there, assuming she could take whatever she wanted. I couldn't help but feel a small, cold satisfaction knowing that this time, the door was closed. An hour later, another message came through. Victor has been evicted. His things are being removed as we speak. I smirked, almost wishing I could be there to see the look on his face. Victor Davila had always been a charmer, the kind of guy who coasted through life with a smug grin and empty pockets, mooching off of anyone who would let him. He must have thought he'd hit the jackpot with Elena, an easy in to my world and my money. It was a mistake he'd pay for now, in ways he hadn't anticipated. I poured myself a coffee and let the day play out, each alert from Carl hitting my phone like a quiet drumbeat of finality. I didn't need to chase her down, didn't need to say a single word. Every message I'd needed to send was already in place. By mid-afternoon, it was almost laughable. Elena had tried accessing her credit cards, calling the bank to fix the error, no doubt furious and demanding explanations. Carl kept me updated, and with each attempt she made, I felt another piece of closure. Finally, the last notification came in. Her accounts were frozen, her keys would no longer work, and every link to Hayes Global was wiped clean. There was no more Mrs. Hayes in the system. Only Elena, on her own. I didn't need revenge. This right here was enough. By late afternoon, I'd packed away the last of her things. Her closet was empty, the little details that once made this place hers, gone. The penthouse felt different, lighter, like it could finally breathe again. I found myself standing there in the middle of the room, almost unsure of what to do next. The big steps were done. I'd cut her out financially, shielded everything she thought she could walk away with, and cleared her from my life. But the silence afterward was something else. Then, right on cue, Carl called. I picked up, hearing the familiar hum of traffic in the background on his end. Adrian, he started, and I could tell by his tone he was holding back something. Go ahead, I said, bracing myself. I'd been prepared for every angle, every loose end, but with Elena, there was always the chance of some last-ditch effort to squirm out of this. She's at your mother's house. He let the words settle. Apparently, she showed up there, desperate, trying to get sympathy, but your mother. Let's just say she wasn't having it. My mother. Strong, stubborn, and fiercely loyal. The kind of woman who didn't believe in letting people get away with betrayal, no matter who they were. I hadn't involved her in all of this, hadn't wanted her to see what a mess my marriage had turned into. But if Elena was trying to worm her way back in through sympathy, she'd have chosen the wrong person. What did she say? I asked, curious but also strangely proud. Carl chuckled softly. Well, she sent Elena packing. Said something along the lines of, I don't know what you're looking for here, but you've already made your choice. She didn't let her inside, Adrian. Didn't even give her a chance. I almost laughed. It was the most fitting end I could have imagined. Elena, looking for a lifeline, only to be turned away by the family she'd betrayed. I could picture the look on her face, the sudden realization that she'd burned every bridge behind her. Good, I replied, feeling a surge of satisfaction. Let her face it. Carl and I talked for a bit longer, going over a few final details, making sure there were no loose threads left to tie up. Once we hung up, I took a long look around the place, seeing it with fresh eyes. I hadn't really been alone in years, and as much as it all felt raw and strange, it also felt right. No more lies, no more pretending. As evening settled in, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something. A fresh start. Maybe. But it was surreal, the penthouse quiet, the weight of Elena's presence lifted, like the air itself had changed. I poured a glass of wine and walked back out onto the balcony, letting the noise of the city fade into the background. It was strange, though. I kept thinking back to when Elena and I had first moved in here. She'd been so excited, calling it her dream home, filling it with all her plans, her vision. I'd always been more practical, but watching her light up as we moved in, talking about how this place would be where we built our life together, it had meant something to me. I really thought this was it, that we were building something solid. But now, standing here with that glass in hand, I could see how much I'd blinded myself. Elena had a way of making everything seem larger than life, adding flair to the simplest moments. I'd fallen for it, ignored my gut instincts every time something felt off, every time I saw that subtle shift in her eyes or heard the little lies she thought I wouldn't catch. That was her trick. Making me feel like the problem was with me. I'd hear her excuses, her justifications, and convince myself I was the one being paranoid, too focused on my work to be fair to her. She was good at that, manipulating situations to her advantage. I'd lost count of the number of times I let things slide, thinking it would keep the peace, thinking she'd come around and remember the life we were supposed to be building. But now, with everything out in the open, I saw it all for what it was. An act, a carefully constructed illusion. And this time I was done. I'd broken free from her game. I took a long sip of the wine, savoring the taste in a way I hadn't in years. It felt like the first moment I'd truly had to myself, without the weight of her expectations or the pressure of keeping up appearances. I let out a deep breath, feeling a rare sense of peace, of clarity. This was my space now, my life, and I could finally live it on my terms. The phone buzzed again, breaking the silence. Another message from Carl. Victor tried contacting his bank. Complete dead end. I chuckled, imagining Victor, the man who thought he'd walk away with my money and my wife, scrambling as every door he thought was open slammed shut in his face. He'd gambled on Elena, thinking she'd be his golden ticket, his way into my life, my resources. But tonight, he was left with nothing. Just another man whose reach had far exceeded his grasp. And as for Elena, she'd chosen her path, traded everything we had for the thrill of the double life she thought she could maintain. Now she'd have to live with the consequences, feeling every door close, every bridge burn. I set the empty glass down and looked out over the city one last time, taking in the view I hadn't fully appreciated in years. In that quiet moment, I realized that maybe losing her wasn't a loss at all. The night wore on, and the penthouse felt like it was shifting back to its original state. Clean, empty, mine again. For the first time in years, I felt like I could finally exhale, like I'd been holding my breath this whole marriage, waiting for the inevitable. The wine glass sat empty on the counter, and as I stared at it, I thought of all the times I'd come home late to find her waiting up, acting like she'd been sitting there just to see me walk through the door. Back then, I'd believed it. Now, it felt like I was looking back at a stranger. By midnight, I was wide awake, restlessly pacing around the penthouse. I hadn't planned on it, but I found myself in the small room she'd set up as her office. She hardly used it. Elena was all about appearances, more interested in the idea of being the high-powered wife than actually following through. It was neat, meticulously organized, and untouched, like everything else she'd decorated in her life. The desk held a few half-filled notebooks, her laptop, and a stack of books I doubted she'd opened once. I leaned against the doorway, a strange urge tugging at me to flip through her things, to see what had been left behind. But I stopped myself, realizing that anything I found wouldn't change a thing. The Elena I'd once known didn't exist. She was someone I'd built up in my head, a reflection of what I'd wanted her to be, not who she truly was. Back in the living room, I sat down with another glass, letting the city lights flood through the windows. I kept expecting to feel some kind of anger or regret, some pang of loss that I'd held onto this long for nothing. But instead, all I felt was a kind of relief, a clean slate. I was free. No more lies. No more charades. Then my phone buzzed on the coffee table. A message from Carl. "Victor just posted a rant online," he wrote. "Says he's been financially ruined. Claims a certain someone went after him." I couldn't help but laugh. The arrogance of the man was almost impressive. He truly thought he could waltz into my life, ruin my marriage, and walk away with my money. Now, he was learning the hard way what it felt like to have nothing to fall back on. I could picture him in some dim, cramped room, furiously typing away, trying to pin the blame anywhere but on himself. It wouldn't take long for word to spread in his social circles. The people who once lavished him with praise and admiration would quickly turn their backs, each one distancing themselves from the scandal of associating with him. I replied to Carl's text. "Let him rant. It'll only make it worse for him." Carl sent back a quick thumbs up, and I leaned back, finally feeling the tension drain out of me. They were left with each other now, their little alliance built on lies, deceit, and ambition. Let them cling to each other, if they could even stand to. People like Victor and Elena only knew how to take, never how to give, and it was only a matter of time before they turned on each other. Tomorrow would be the first day of a new chapter. And I was ready. I made my own breakfast for the first time in years, something simple, a couple of eggs and toast, a fresh pot of coffee. It was quiet, almost unsettlingly so, but also peaceful. I realized I hadn't sat at my own table like this in months. I'd been working late most nights, deliberately avoiding dinners at home, those long, silent meals where every bite felt like a performance we'd both grown tired of. Now, it was just me, the simple morning routine I'd forgotten I actually enjoyed. As I sipped my coffee, I saw the stack of documents on the kitchen counter. The evidence Carl had gathered, all the bank statements, hotel receipts, photos, everything Elena had kept buried under lies and excuses. It was ironic, seeing the life I thought I knew laid bare in cold hard facts. This was her, this was the truth, and I had all the proof right here. I packed up the files and tucked them into the envelope meant for her mother. They didn't need an explanation. The documents spoke for themselves, a cold reminder that Elena wasn't the person they'd thought, either. I could already imagine her mother's face as she read through everything, the shock, the disbelief, maybe even denial. But in the end, they'd know. She couldn't hide behind charm and empty promises anymore. I dropped the package off with a courier, adding a brief note. It didn't say much, just a few words. "Here's the truth. Goodbye, Adrian. Let them make of it what they would." I was done explaining myself, done feeling like I owed anyone anything. With that errand done, I stepped out into the fresh morning air. For the first time, the city felt open, almost inviting, like there was a world I'd ignored for too long waiting outside. I walked aimlessly, finding myself in a nearby park. People bustled by, heading to work, tourists snapping photos, parents out with their kids. I found a bench under a tree, sat down, and just watched it all. My phone buzzed with a text from Carl. Just wanted to confirm that everything's settled. Legal's working on the last loose ends, and Elena won't have any access to Hayes' global or personal assets. I sent a quick reply. "Thanks, Carl. Let's move forward with the rest of it." I'm ready. With everything falling into place, there was nothing left to worry about. Hayes Global was secure, the penthouse was mine, and Elena. Well, she'd have to figure out her own life now, without the luxury she'd taken for granted. There was a kind of quiet satisfaction in it, a feeling that, finally, I had the upper hand and didn't need to look back. Sitting there, I found myself thinking about what would come next. Without the obligations, without the weight of a marriage held together by appearances and lies, the future was wide open. It was strange, even exhilarating to feel that freedom again. 4 years, I'd been planning every step, every investment, every merger, always with one eye on how it would look, how it would impact our life together. Now it was all mine. The choices, the risks, the rewards, every bit of it was up to me. As I walked back to the penthouse, I couldn't help but notice how different everything felt. The familiar streets, the coffee shop on the corner, even the doorman's nod as I passed. All of it felt sharper, like I was seeing it through new eyes. It was strange, really. I hadn't realized how much of myself I'd lost in the constant effort to keep my marriage intact, to fit into this life Elena and I had built. Or rather, the one she'd built to suit her needs. When I got back, I found myself in the study, the room I'd started using less and less over the years. I ran my hand over the smooth mahogany desk, feeling an odd surge of nostalgia. This was the space where I'd built Hayes Global, from a modest property startup to one of the most respected firms in the industry. I used to spend long nights here, diving into blueprints, strategies, contracts. Elena used to complain about it, saying it was like competing with a ghost. I'd compromised, moved my work to the office, and gave her the space she wanted. Looking around now, I realized I'd been the one pushed out. The desk was cluttered with files I hadn't looked at in weeks, maybe months. I pulled out a project proposal that had been buried beneath the rest, a new development in Scotland, a project I'd personally wanted to oversee, one that had potential to be something remarkable. I'd been so consumed with keeping everything else together that I'd put it on hold, told Carl to handle it. But now, it was calling to me. It felt like the kind of project that would need all my focus, something to pour myself into fully. I sent Carl a message. I want to move forward on the Scotland project. Let's get a team together to discuss. He replied instantly. Sounds good, boss. Thought you might be ready for it. That message brought a rare smile to my face. Carl knew me better than anyone, maybe even better than I'd known myself these past few years. He'd seen the strain, seen how I'd let my personal life cloud the way I ran the business. But this project, this was the kind of fresh start I needed. Something concrete, something I could build from the ground up on my terms. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the Scotland project wasn't just about business. It was a way to get out of this penthouse, out of London, and put some distance between myself and the life Elena and I had tangled ourselves in. A place where I could actually breathe again, see new faces, experience life in a way I hadn't in years. By evening, I'd made up my mind. I called Carl, knowing he'd already guessed my decision. I'm heading up to Scotland for a few weeks, I told him. I want to be on site, see the land myself. Carl didn't miss a beat. I'll arrange everything. Team's been eager to get started. After we hung up, I looked around the penthouse one last time, already feeling like I was saying goodbye. The walls, the furniture, the carefully selected decor, it all felt like artifacts of someone else's life, a life I no longer had any claim to. I'd let myself get caught up in the image Elena wanted, the lifestyle she'd crafted around us. But now, with nothing holding me here, it was time to reclaim something real. By the time I packed a bag and called a driver to take me to the airport, I felt lighter than I had in years. Scotland was waiting, and for the first time in a long time, I had something to look forward to. The drive to the airport was quiet, and for once, I welcomed the silence. I watched the city pass by, each street and building pulling up memories of the life I'd once imagined for myself and Elena. London had been the backdrop to everything. Our early days, our successes, even the rough patches we'd worked so hard to ignore. But now, it felt like a place I'd outgrown, something I was ready to leave behind. At the airport, I went through the motions, moving through security, boarding, settling into my seat. Once I'd buckled in, I felt the weight of all the recent days settle on me. It had been a whirlwind, a marriage crumbling, a carefully constructed life unraveling, the swift steps to secure my business and protect everything I'd built. And yet, through it all, I felt oddly at peace, like I was finally moving towards something that was mine. The plane took off, and as I looked out the window, watching London shrink below, I thought about what lay ahead. The Scotland project was ambitious. a chance to create something new in a place that still held an untouched, natural beauty. It was more than just a development plan. It felt like a chance to reset, to throw myself into work that would test me, challenge me, and pull me away from all the noise of my old life. The flight was short, and before I knew it, we were landing in Edinburgh. A driver Carl had arranged was waiting for me at the airport, and we took off into the Scottish countryside, heading north toward the land Hayes Global had acquired. As we drove, the city lights faded behind us, replaced by rolling green hills and mist-covered mountains that stretched out endlessly under a gray sky. There was something about it that was both haunting and calming, like this place held secrets it would reveal only in time. I arrived at the hotel just before dusk. It was a small place, modest but warm, with stone walls and old wooden beams that spoke of history. I checked in, dropped my bag in the room, and decided to take a walk around the grounds. The evening air was cool and smelled faintly of pine, clean and crisp in a way that was so different from the city's constant rush. For the first time in ages, I felt a strange calm settle over me. As I walked along a small path that led up a hill, I could see the stretch of land Hayes Global had purchased off in the distance. A gentle mist had settled over it, softening the edges and giving the whole place a quiet, almost magical feel. This was where I'd be building something new, a development that respected the land, that brought something meaningful to the area. The challenge of it, the scope, felt right. It was exactly what I needed, something demanding and grounding. I stood there, breathing in the stillness, feeling the weight of everything slowly lifting. I hadn't just left London. I'd left behind a version of myself that had been drowning in expectations, in the pressures of a life I'd let someone else define. Here, there was space to start fresh, to reconnect with the parts of myself I'd set aside for too long. When I headed back to the hotel, the sky was darkening, stars just beginning to peek through the clouds. I realized I was looking forward to tomorrow, to the work that lay ahead. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of purpose that was mine alone. The next morning, I was up early, ready to see the land in daylight. There was a strange excitement building in me, the kind I hadn't felt in years. It reminded me of those early days when Hayes Global was just an idea on paper. Back then, every project felt like uncharted territory, a new challenge to conquer. Over the years, that excitement had dimmed, buried under routine and responsibilities. But now, standing on the edge of this wild open land in Scotland, it felt like I'd found that spark again. The survey team was already out there, marking boundaries and assessing the land. I made my way over, greeting them as I joined in. They were locals, rugged no-nonsense men who didn't waste words, but their faces showed a quiet respect for the land. As we walked the property, one of them, a tall, weathered guy named Angus, pointed out the natural springs and patches of forest that dotted the area. "This place has history, Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice low but steady. "You'll want to treat it right." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words. This wasn't just another development. It was a place that deserved more than flashy buildings and quick returns. I could feel it in the air, in the way the landscape stretched out, untouched and timeless. We continued the survey, Angus and the others explaining the land's unique features, the way the hills sloped, the rock formations that added character to the area. I listened carefully, realizing I hadn't felt this engaged in years. This was real work, the kind where every decision had weight, where the outcome mattered on more than just a financial level. As we moved through the property, I kept catching glimpses of the distant mountains, the light shifting across them as clouds passed by. It was humbling in a way I hadn't expected, and I found myself feeling something I'd almost forgotten: respect. Respect for the place, for the people who had known it long before I ever came along, and for the opportunity to create something worthy of it. When we finally broke for lunch, I sat with Angus and the team, sharing the sandwiches I'd picked up at the local market. There was no talk of profits or deadlines, just simple, easy conversation. I realized how different this was from my usual business lunches, where every word was calculated, every moment geared toward the next deal. Here, there was none of that pressure, just honest work and real people. Later that afternoon, as we wrapped up, I found myself lingering, not wanting to leave the land just yet. I walked alone to the far edge of the property, where the hills dipped down into a small valley. Standing there, I felt the weight of the last few years lift a bit more. I was finally stepping into something new, leaving behind a version of myself that had been chained to a life that wasn't real. By the time I headed back to the hotel, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't just here to oversee a project. I was here to build something meaningful, something that felt like a true reflection of the man I wanted to be. This wasn't about Hayes Global anymore. This was personal. This was the start of a new legacy, one that I'd build from the ground up, without anyone else's agenda weighing it down. In that quiet Scottish countryside, far from the complications of my old life, I realized I'd finally found what I was looking for. That evening, back at the hotel, I sat by the fire in the small lounge, watching the flames crackle and dance in the dim light. The day had been full, more than just work. It was like I'd tapped into something buried deep within me, a version of myself I hadn't connected with in years. I felt an unusual calm settle over me, something solid and grounded. I wasn't just overseeing this project. I was part of it, woven into the land and the future it held. I pulled out my notebook, the one I'd carried with me since the early days of Hayes Global. Flipping through the pages, I passed sketches and scribbled notes from years ago, plans that once felt ambitious but were now just reminders of a life that no longer fit. Near the back of the notebook, there was a blank page, waiting for new ideas, new goals. I found myself sketching out a vision of the property, my hand moving without much thought as I drew the land, the buildings I imagined, the paths that would wind through the trees, leaving the natural beauty untouched. The door to the lounge opened, and I looked up to see a few locals walking in, greeting each other with nods and handshakes. They spoke in quiet voices, exchanging the latest news and stories of the day. One of them, an older man with a grizzled beard and eyes that seemed to hold years of wisdom, caught my gaze. He nodded toward the empty chair beside me. "Mind if I join?" he asked, his accent thick with the rough music of the Highlands. "Not at all," I replied, motioning for him to sit. He introduced himself as Donald, a retired farmer who'd lived in the area his whole life. We chatted about the land, the seasons, the way the light changes over the hills, and I listened as he spoke with a familiarity that only came from a lifetime spent here. When I mentioned the project, Donald's expression shifted, a mix of curiosity and caution. "You'll be building on that land up the way then?" "Yes," I said, nodding slowly. "But I want to do it right. I don't want to ruin what's already here. This place, it's special. You can feel it." Donald's eyes softened, a flicker of approval crossing his face. It is. You're a stranger, yet you see it," he said. "Most folks come here just to turn it into something it's not. But if you're aiming to respect it, maybe there's hope yet." I appreciated his honesty, and I told him as much. We fell into a comfortable silence after that, just watching the fire, each lost in our own thoughts. For the first time in years, I felt like I was part of something that went beyond myself, beyond Hayes Global or any ambitions I'd once had. This wasn't about money or status. It was about creating something that mattered. After Donald left, I stayed a while longer, thinking about everything he'd said. It was true. I was a stranger here, but I felt a connection to this place that I hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe I'd been looking for that all along, a place where I could be real, where the past didn't have to weigh me down. As I finally made my way back to my room, I realized I was already feeling at home. This land, this project, this new beginning, it was everything I hadn't known I needed. And for the first time since I could remember, I went to bed feeling content, knowing I was right where I needed to be. The next morning, I woke up early, the mist still hanging low over the hills, casting everything in a soft, quiet light. I stood by the window, watching the fog slowly lift, revealing the rolling green landscape. Today, I'd be back on the property, meeting with the team, getting the groundwork started. But as I looked out over the land, I realized that something inside me had already shifted. This place, this project, it was more than just work. It was a chance to leave behind the old version of myself, the one shackled to a life I'd outgrown, and step fully into something new. After breakfast, I drove out to the property, feeling that same excitement building as I neared the site. The team was already there, setting up equipment, marking the layout, checking the soil. I joined them, talking through plans, discussing every detail. As the day unfolded, I saw the vision coming to life, not just as a project, but as something personal, something I was building not for profit or recognition, but simply because it felt right. Near midday, I took a break, walking out to the edge of the property, looking over the hills that stretched into the distance. I stood there for a long time, taking it all in. Everything was quiet, peaceful, almost timeless. It was the kind of place that demanded respect, that reminded you to slow down, to be present, to let go of anything that didn't truly matter. For the first time in years, I didn't feel weighed down by expectations or responsibilities that weren't mine. There were no pretenses here, no facade to keep up, no life that needed managing. Just me, the land, and a future that was finally mine to shape. I could almost feel the chains of my past slipping away, the weight lifting from my shoulders as I stood there, breathing in the cool, clean air. I thought of Elena, of the life we'd built and then lost, of the countless times I'd tried to hold onto something that wasn't real. It didn't hurt anymore. In a way, I was grateful. She'd set me free in the end, even if it had come at a cost. I was free to build something new, something honest, something that was mine alone. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the hills, I felt a rare sense of peace settle over me. This was where I was meant to be, not in a penthouse in London, not in boardrooms filled with people who barely knew me. Here, I could finally be myself, stripped of the past, ready to embrace whatever came next. I turned back to the land, my land now, the project waiting to unfold under my hands. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't just the end of one chapter. It was the beginning of a story I'd write for myself. A life built from the ground up, honest and true. A life that, for the first time in a long time, felt whole.